Americans who are supposed to be so hateful. It's not how America is. But there is an alternative point of view. And there is an alternative point of view to the metropolitan, sophisticated, as I can say as a Jew, the metropolitan, sophisticated, often Jewish-oriented, intelligent, literary point of view, which, with its standard, liberal points of view, there is an alternative to that. There's an alternative to that, which is that of the homesteader, that of the family, that of the not wishing to get involved in the rest of the world, not really wanting to understand it, that of not wanting the scummy tide of crime and drugs to roll over them. And the interpretation of the scummy tide of drugs and crime being that of too much liberality, too much openness, not enough discipline, not enough family. Now, we can argue this. We can say, no, I don't believe that's where the drugs and the crime come from. But we've got to be, as liberals, if that's what we are, we've got to be grown up enough not to insult people who have another point of view with a cheap, easy, they're just right-wing redneck idiots. Because they're not.
One of the...
Some of you.
One of the things that's most impressive about America is the social and even financial engagement with their own small local communities.
Yes.
The level of giving, in terms of almost tithing, is incredibly impressive, and that's particularly prevalent in these more rural, as you say, homestead communities.
It is, yes, the culture of endowment, you might call it, which at the local level, and of course famously at the metropolitan level, the enormous endowments to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Opera or the Whitney or whichever art gallery it might be. But also, you're right, in the small levels of endowment. Now, that is both admirable and, to us, perhaps bad. I mean, I remember having a really strong argument, and this is a warning for anybody in America. We live in a country where we have an adversarial court system and an adversarial parliamentary system, and we are, brought up, as it were, I nearly said from our nanny's knees, and I realised that was a bit old-fashioned. We are brought up, unless you mean nanny mean grandmother, of course. We say, well, shut up, Stephen, don't dig if you're in a hole. We are brought up, is all I meant to say, in an adversarial tradition in which at a dinner party or around a table or in a pub, we can say, no, that's this is the case. Now, aside from the fact that the word means nothing to an American, substituted with rubbish or balls, if you said that to an American, they would feel personally affronted in a very deep way. And I've known a lot of British people who have become persona non grata at dinner parties because they've debated in a fierce way and offended deeply. They go, how dare you talk to me like that? And I remember one of the ways I almost got in this situation was on this very subject you've asked me about, where they said, but the reason we have such generosity is because we don't have, like you do in Europe, this socialized. When they say socialized in America, they mean socialist. So you have socialized arts. In other words, the government gives some money towards the arts, or we have the BBC, or we have subsidy in theatre and in galleries, and we have obviously a National Health Service and so on. And I remember saying, which I thought was a reasonable point d'appui for an argument, if nothing else, I said, well, isn't it odd? You've got a socialized army. That if you have an enemy, you decide that the taxpayer should club together to form an army to defeat the enemy and to defend your nation against that enemy. What is so different about forming an army to defend your nation against ignorance and calling it socialized education, or having an army to fight against disease and having socialized medicine? Why is one perfectly acceptable? Why don't you have a privatized army? Well, they almost did under Bush. And they kind of go, oh, that's just typical socialism. I said, well, no. And I started to get quite angry about it, and there had to be a lot of backing down. That is one of the most deep schisms you'll find. Even liberal Americans, often, they'll say, oh, gosh, you're so lucky to have a national theatre. But if you said to them, well, why don't you have federal grant? They say, oh, no, that's not a good idea. That's socialism. Socialism it's nomenclature. Why isn't an army socialism? If you can have an army to fight an enemy, then let that enemy be called disease and ignorance and so on. That's the Beveridge report, essentially, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. See, I'm doing it again. I'm getting all hot under the collar and becoming embarrassing.
No, you're so
It's
not.
time to open it up to the
It
floor.
is, indeed. Stephen, thank you very much for that.
Gentleman over there.
And there's a lady down here who you'll get to first.
Oh, right.
You said that you talked about the Americans not being unsophisticated and that shouldn't be judged. Yet, isn't sort of ignorance dangerous?
Ignorance is always dangerous, but I don't necessarily think that we in Britain have any particular right to cast that stone. With the beam in our own eye seems to be... I mean, if you were to look, for example, throughout the 80s, the most successful television show in America, the consistent #1 TV show in America was Frasier, which was a show about elitism, in which they would have a whole episode in which the thing that drove the plot was whether or not, you know, Niles would get that bottle of Margaux, 1982, that he had bid for. Well, there's no British show that's ever had that level of sophistication. Or look at The West Wing. Look at American TV, you know, with the exception of the things we've given them, like bloody this idol or that talent. Then, you know, where the hell do we get off? You know, if you throw a stone in a market town in England and ask the person that stone hits on the head, you know, where Heligoland is, or which island of Indonesia I'm pointing at, or what the capital of, you know, of Peru is, and I don't think you get a better answer in Britain than you do in America. It's just typical of us British. The one thing we seem to think we have left is the ability to sneer at Americans. Now, all that reveals is our own insecurity. Do you think Americans spend 0.00001% of their time worrying about us? All that reveals is our sense of inadequacy, is our sense that, so, all right, okay, you've got more this, more that, more the other, you're more successful at this, you're more successful at that, you've got a more interesting that, and more people want to live in your country than in our country, but we know lots more than you do. Well, it's just not true. I just don't accept it, to be honest. And yes, of course you can stop people in the street in America, and you can go on YouTube and find examples of it, where people are pointing at maps and saying, which continent is this? And the Americans going, Denmark? And we all get a good laugh and feel better about ourselves. But
Only when the person in question is the president.
Yeah.
Then it's very alarming.
That's a very good point.
There's a question over here.
I just have a question about Obama. Obama was really popular in America mostly because his rhetoric and his message was able to go across party lines. But do you think that abroad, if he had been the same guy with the same rhetoric, would his message not have been as well received had his politics been different? If Obama had been a Republican, do you think international perception would have been different?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think there was unquestionably an appetite in the rest of the world, in Europe certainly, for a Democrat. I mean, what do we, as they would say in America, what do we know from Democrat and Republic? We don't... The dispensation or whatever has changed enormously in America. It used to be, as you will well know, that the South was democratic. It was called the Democratic South. It was the heartland of the Democratic vote, the blue vote on the map. That has changed enormously. And now it's states like your splendid Wisconsin, which is lovely, except when I was there it was always -30, so it was like quite tricky to see a lot of it. But so we don't